I want to talk about this fun and useful accessory from Triggertrap. This is their mobile dongle. Pair this with a smartphone or tablet and you add a whole pile of brains to your DSLR. Well, what does that mean? Well, it allows you to trigger your camera in a variety of different ways. We're just going to dive in and talk about those in just a second. But before we do that, let's briefly mention time lapses. Something like an intervalometer allows you to trigger your camera every X number of seconds, or as this one also does, allow you to switch it into bulb mode by holding down this little plastic button. That's useful. Time lapses can be a lot of fun. Moving clouds, people in a park, flowers blooming. Really, you're limited by your imagination. A spider building a web. So they're a lot of fun, and in a lot of ways they feel like photos in the old days because you have to develop these time lapses. You have to take all of these individual pictures that your camera has taken every X or number of seconds or minutes or hours, put it into a video file and watch it, and you get something completely different than any one of those individual images show. It's fun. And this device allows you to do that and so much more. As I said, let's just jump right in, but I'll show you how it works is you get the little dongle. Everybody gets that. But what you have to figure out is which cable goes to your camera, because each camera has a different type of specific cable connection. And that might sound a little daunting, but you simply go to the Triggertrap website and you say, I have a Canon Rebel T6i. T6i? Not yet. And you then are presented with the connection cord that you need to buy. Links for this are right down below. All the links of things I talk about today will be right down below the description of this video. So you plug it in. Without a smartphone or tablet, this cord really is not very useful. You plug it into a smartphone or tablet. I'm using the iPad mini today simply because that presents a nice screen to record from, but you could use your cell phone, your smartphone, and one of the things that's really nice about this updated version is I found it to be very consistent across multiple devices. There are older dongles. Sometimes with some Android devices I had problems that didn't always work, but I haven't had any issues with this one at all. The app is completely free and it's available for iOS and Android. It gives you this little welcome screen here, and we're just going to kind of scroll through this quickly because I'm talking to you about it and you don't need to read that right now. So you are presented with this little menu that's right down here on the left hand side. I'm just going to scroll through quickly and see that most of those are ways you can trigger your camera when it's plugged into this device. If you drag this back to the right, you can see that I'm currently on motion sensor. But let's start at the top with a simple cable release and work our way down. So I've got my camera in manual mode right now, and let's say I've set up its exposure to be how I want it. It's awake. I press the red button to make some magic happen. The magic in this case, when I press the red button, it takes a picture. You might want to do that instead of actually touching the shutter button because you've got it set up on a tripod. You know it's going to be slightly longer exposure, so you don't want to jiggle the camera at all, or maybe you want to stay back a little bit. It also does allow you to set up a Wi-Fi remote system. So using a phone, you could talk to your tablet, which then triggers it as well. And that allows for putting it out near the bird feeder, whatever. Again, limited by your imagination. So you press the button, it takes a picture. Pretty simple. We press the little hamburger icon in the top left corner and move on down to the next option, quick release. You hold the button down. When you let go of it, it'll take a picture. Again, pretty straightforward. So let's move through those quickly. Press and hold. This is now like the bulb mode in the old days. You press this. Whoopsie. Key here is you need to put your camera into B on the dial. If you don't have B on the dial, in manual mode, if you scroll to 30 seconds, which is usually the maximum limit for mini cameras, you scroll past that point, it'll probably switch to B, and then this will work. So now when I press this, you're going to hear a slightly different sound than we've been hearing. That was half of a shutter opening up. Or I should say, that was the shutter opening, but not closing, because right now, the camera shutter is open and light is streaming in and hitting the sensor. When I let go of this button, you'll hear the rest of the sound of the shutter closing. There it is. We're also hearing the mirror flip up and down, just a little tidbit of information for you. That actually is the loudest part of the whole picture taking process with a DSLR. It's that mirror flipping up and flipping back down. That makes the most noise. And in a little while, we're going to look at switching that off and what it sounds like. All right. Now, you might not want to sit there with your finger on the button the whole time. One of the easiest ways to describe, or a use for this, is taking pictures of lightning. Because if you don't know, you don't sit there waiting for a lightning bolt. When you see one, you go, "Ooh," press the button real quick. Nobody has reflexes like that. By the time you've seen the bolt and told your brain to press the button, the bolt is long gone and you might hear the thunder in a few seconds, but that's all. That doesn't make for very exciting pictures. So one of the easy and cheap ways, if you've got this, or even without this, is to simply set your camera to take a long exposure picture, hope a bolt happens while it's doing it, and then stop the exposure as soon as a bolt has happened, because it'll be captured, plenty bright enough to burn into your sensor, not in a bad way, but a captured way on the photo. This is an easier way where you simply press that button, sit there, wait for a bolt of lightning in the safety of wherever you are, and when one has happened, you press it again. That is better than saying, okay, in the next 15 seconds, take a picture camera, and I hope within that 15 minutes, I hope a bolt of lightning happens, and if it does, then you've got no way to stop the camera. You could put a black cloth in front of it, some people do, but those are clunky methods, and now you've got a really nice method within this program. But wait, there's more. I feel infomercialist, but this is just packed full of creative ways to trigger your camera. There's a time release. So this is a method where you could say, take a picture for 15 minutes, or an hour, or 20 seconds, or 30.1 seconds. You have that ability here. Right now it's set up for an hour long, and if I press the button, all right, let me do it again, so I'll be quiet. There it was opening up, and now this is going to count down from an hour. You can take long exposures. It needs to be very dark to get a proper exposure over an hour long. You'd be pretty amazed. You should experiment with it. It's a lot of fun. One of the longer exposures I've ever taken was about a half an hour long to do star trails. There are better ways to take star trails, including ways within this app. Let's move on down. That was time release and self-timer. Your camera has a self-timer mode. It probably offers a 10-second or 2-second self-timer, but sometimes maybe 10 is a little too much, 2 is too short, or maybe you want to get up onto that rock pile that is 500 yards away and it's going to take you a minute and a half. Well, you can do that here. There we go, minute and a half. I press this button in the red and it counts down for a minute and a half and it can take a picture. Now, if you really were going to do that, go to a rock pile off in the distance, I would not use the self-timer where it's only going to take one picture. I'd go ahead and put it on the intervalometer and just have it take a picture every X number of seconds, and when you get up there on the rock pile, you can strike a couple of fun poses. One of those will be a good one, or multiple, and then you can walk back down to the camera at your leisure. But that allows you the ability to really precisely say when you want the camera to fire, not limited to the camera's 10 or 2 seconds. Now let's get into some more fun time-lapse modes. So the very first one is very straightforward. Again, you set up an interval in between the picture taking. I should be back on manual mode for this with your exposure set up, or you could put it on P or automatic, it doesn't matter. And in this case, I've got it set to say every 2.12 seconds, take a picture. It's really nice to have that precision. You don't quite have that precision with something like a little plastic intervalometer. And you know, this is where we start to leave this little device far, far behind. Not to mention that these cost sometimes a little bit cheaper than this, but they're often quite cheaply made, and even the ones that you pay a lot more for, I found to be made about the same as the $12 and $15 ones. So every 2.12 seconds, or maybe every hour if you've got battery life that can support that. Speaking of battery life, one of the questions that I frequently get is, yes, you do need to leave your iPad or your smartphone on and running when it's connected. You can't shut the lid, or you know, if you got a smart cover, things like that. And battery drain when the screen is bright. You can of course turn it down so that it doesn't drain the battery as fast. But something like the little RAV Power battery, and I'll be talking more about that this week, is a great way to power your device for hours and hours on end. So keep that in mind. Below time-lapse, we have time warp. Now, early on in the days of this app, this was a feature, but it was a little confusing. And they've really added some neat features that help you understand what's happening here. So time-lapse obviously just takes a picture every X number of seconds, and you're going to play that back, maybe at say 24 frames a second. It's going to have a constant motion to it. Clouds are moving towards you. They're going to move towards you at the same rate unless the wind has changed or something like that. Or let's say the hand of a clock moving around. That's going to change. That's not going to change over the course of a time lapse every X number of seconds. But let's say that you wanted over the course of the time lapse of that clock for it to speed up and time just be blazing by at the end. Well, of course you could do that in video editing, but you can't really do it smoothly. You have to, at some point, pick a spot, cut it, and say start to speed it up a little faster and a little faster, unless you really get into some heavy video editing that allows that. I don't want to go down that road too far. This allows you to say, take 500 pictures over a certain amount of time, and then within that, vary the length of the exposure, or sorry, the length of the interval to give me a different look. That might be confusing, but an easy way to demonstrate what it's going to do is to hit this little icon down here in the bottom right corner. Let's do this first. Let's just make it this kind of straight line. We hit this, and you can see that over the course of that animation, it showed you that it's going to remain constant. That hand moved around that circle at the same speed all the way. But what if we drag this over to the right a little bit, and we have this type of graph now, and we hit the animation? Did you see what it did at the beginning? Much faster. So in this case, it's going to give us the opposite of what I described. At the beginning of the video that you play back, that hand on the clock is going to just blaze around until it gets towards the end of the animation. You've set 500 frames, and then it's going to slow down. We could do the opposite of that if we move it this way, and notice that you can ease in and ease out. Oops, it's trying to write. Now let's press that little icon. Slow to start and very fast to end. Pretty slick. You can vary the exposures, the number, the time, total amount of time. And my goal now, after I go through all of these, put this out there to the world, is to create more examples, actual examples of this over the next couple of weeks. And so to give you an idea of some of the things. But what I'd love to hear and see from you all is your ideas. And feel free to give me ideas as well and say, go shoot this or that, and I'll try to do my best because it's a lot of fun, but it's hard. One of the other downsides is finding the time and a place to set your camera up so it's safe without worrying about it. But as I said, I've been doing some flowering time lapses and things like that. So that's time warps. Distance lapse. You could certainly put your camera in a car and tell it to take a picture every 2 seconds or 5 seconds over the course of a road trip. It's kind of a fun way to remember where you've been and what the scenery looked like. That's going to give you a very different look depending on how fast or slow you're moving. If you want a more consistent time lapse, consider triggering your camera via GPS and distance traveled instead of time. That's going to be more consistent depending on what, even if you're stuck in traffic or you're blazing down the highway. So you can simply say trigger the shutter every 800 meters. Now, you do have to have a device that has a GPS in it. This little iPad mini does not because it's the Wi-Fi only version. So iPad minis or iPads with cellular service do have GPSs. All of your smartphones have GPSs. So there's a lot of different options there for that. And it's a neat way to trigger your camera. I've done distance lapse, and I'll put links to the ones that I've done already down below. Star trail. So I mentioned that I took a long exposure, about a half an hour long, and the stars were all blurred into kind of half circles, not quite half. But the more typical way for people to capture star trails is to take a series of images that they then stack, shorter exposures that capture a short star trail, and then stack them all together. That's a little bit nicer on your sensor and your camera that way. And so you could say take 10 exposures at of 1 minute and 30 seconds each, with just 5 seconds in between. Down in the bottom right corner of many of these is a little light bulb that gives you a quick tip, like reminder, hey, you need to be in bulb mode for this to work, as I demonstrated earlier when I wasn't. The last one in this time-lapse section that we're going to talk about is bramping, and this allows you to do the holy grail of gradual sunset and sunrise time lapses, where you get a nice smooth transition from bright light to twilight if you're going for sunset, or over the sunrise if you're going for a sunrise. You think, well, can I just do that? Can I just set my camera up at a constant exposure and it's going to capture this? You gotta remember, our camera's dynamic range is much smaller than your eyes are. And what looks to us to be beautiful colors just a few minutes after sunset If you set a constant exposure that captured a few minutes ago nicely, it's now going to be almost pitch black. It's about 2 stops of light per 10 minutes in your normal kind of typical conditions at sunrise or sunset. And very quickly you can have a completely blown out if you're trying to capture a sunrise, or a completely dark if you're trying to capture a sunset. You could allow your camera to adjust the shutter speed automatically. Let's say you put it on aperture priority mode and you say f5.6, ISO 800, and you adjust your shutter speed, or allow the camera to adjust the shutter speed to keep a middle exposure. Yes, but that's going to be very boring as well, because then you're not going to get any sense of that transition. You're simply going to get the same amount of light as it slows its shutter speed down more and more and more to try to bring in enough light to keep that exposure in the middle. Bramping allows you to gradually adjust the shutter speed so that you do get a change. We see the change in the video as it's played back of the sun setting and the colors that come out and the darkening, slow darkening of the sky. But you still will eventually run into the end, but it will allow you to do it much more gradually and much more naturally. It's pretty neat. You simply say how many exposures you want to take, the interval of each one, and what the starting shutter speed should be and the ending shutter speed should be. Without talking about this in too much depth, because I'd love to come back and talk about it more, and I have talked about it in other videos as well. You want to do shutter speed and not aperture, because aperture is going to change the look of your depth of field if you vary that over time, and that's going to be jarring in a video. And if you change your ISO, that's going to be very jarring as well, because that will then create a very grainy look and part of your image or part of your video versus a very clean look in others. One thing that I would like to see Triggertrap add in the future is the ability to adjust this on the fly, because once you start running it, it's going to be running and that's what you're going to get. It would be nice, based on feedback you get by looking at the review images on the back of the camera, to be able to say, well, I'm going a little bit too fast through my bramp, or I need to speed up a little bit to catch up. And that's something I'd like to see them add in the future. But it's pretty neat. And then you simply say what your starting shutter speed should be, what your ending shutter speed should be, and you've got from 1/15 of a second to 10 seconds. And again, I'd like to see a little bit more variety, or not variety, but I'd like to see a bigger range there. But that's enough for most typical bramping sessions. Now, that was for all the time-lapse modes. Now we're talking about sensor modes. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of these to keep this video from getting too long. This is on an iPad that's laying down and the camera's kind of buried, but what if you put your smartphone in this little holder, links to all of this are right down below, and this little hot shoe guy, you slide it up here and suddenly you've attached to the top of your camera a whole lot of brains. And you can use the camera that's on your smartphone to trigger not only the camera, but the gyroscopes to sense, the microphone to sense noise. And all of those can be used to trigger your camera. Let's look at the sound sensor really quickly. So I press this red button and it's listening right now. You can see that red line moving around, and the thin red line is where I've set my limit. I've set it at max because I'm talking right next to it. It's kind of loud. But if you watch, I've got to make sure the camera's awake. Camera always has to be awake for this to work. When I snap my fingers, that's going to be loud enough for it to trigger a picture. Worked quite nicely. Just like that. And so you could have the setup on top of your camera and you get into a group picture, you want to clap to take the picture, there you go. Every time you clap, it's going to take a picture. There is also the face recognition. And you can say once you've seen 2 faces in the picture, then take a picture. So again, set this up here, and suddenly your camera that has no idea about number of faces, many of our more advanced DSLRs do not offer this feature that point and shoots do, that here are some faces in the camera. When I say there's 2, take a picture. I'm going to put it on 1, and let me see if I can get my face in there. Yep, saw my face. So I'm going to turn that back off. The last 2, I'm not going to get into right now, the LE HDR and LE HDR time-lapse, other than to say, when you want to take a really long exposure, that's what LE stands for there, long exposure time-lapse, you are limited to 30 seconds total length of shutter speed in your camera, unless you switch to bulb mode. And then using the Triggertrap app, you can say, I want one exposure to be a minute long, I want one to be 2 minutes long, and the overexposed one to be 3 minutes long. You are suddenly not constrained by that 30-second limit. And you can even set up to take 3 of these images and then you work them together into an HDR, and you've got a time lapse, 3 images sandwiched into an HDR, 3 images sandwiched into an HDR, on and on and on to get this really incredible dynamic ranged time lapse. Those are there. I'd love to come back and talk about them some more in the future. I mentioned this briefly, that you can use Wi-Fi to talk to your tablet and the Triggertrap app to trigger it remotely. So a lot of people ask me, what are free ways to trigger your camera remotely? This does not allow for any live view. That's a common question I get. There's no live view streaming here. Triggertrap doesn't do that. It simply triggers your camera based on different timing and, as you've seen, sensor modes. But you can set it up so that it's all connected, ready to go, and running the app on another device that's connected to the tablet, connected to your camera, you can remotely trigger it. And again, using all of those different methods to remotely trigger it, not just push a button. So if you want face detection someplace else in the room looking when it triggers, it can do that. Or sound, all of those different ones we saw. And 2 things they've added fairly recently that I think is really cool. It's a nifty little ND filter. Those are the sunglass filters that you put on your lens. They basically cut down on the amount of light. And you can say what stop you are using and what your base shutter speed is, and it's going to give you what your shutter speed needs to be. This is nice if you're trying to do longer exposures of waterfalls and calculate that out. Another one that's really great is the solar calculator. Just simply gives you your sunrise and sunset. I live in Brattleboro, and you can see our sunrise and sunset right there, and it lets you know. Also lets you know the last light, so that's helpful in kind of trying to figure out your bramping setup. So, in the Wi-Fi, we'll come back and talk about that in the future. This video has gone on long enough. This is the Triggertrap app and mobile dongle and device. If you've got questions about it, leave them down below. I will try to point you to my other videos that I've already done on this, but as I said, I'm going to come back because they've updated it, so I need to update my videos, and plus it's just a lot of fun. I hope this was useful. If you have found this to be useful, hit that like button. If you haven't subscribed, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. That's an easy way to thank me for my time and not miss future videos talking about all of these little devices, some that you may have no idea existed, that makes your DSLR or camera just that much more fun. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.